Hey guys. Tonight, we're doing one of those stories that sounds dramatic, but somehow turns out to be very slow, very sad, and deeply awkward for everyone involved. So dim the lights. Put the phone down face down if you want. Get comfortable. And let's gently drift back into a time when a woman could be crowned queen, dressed in gold, paraded through cities, and still be considered a complete failure if her body didn't cooperate. Tonight, we're talking about medieval queens who couldn't produce an heir. Not queens who rebelled. Not queens who ruled brilliantly. Just queens whose main historical crime was not getting pregnant fast enough. And yes, this never ended well for them. Because of course it didn't. Now, before we float into specific lives, we need to set the mood. Medieval Europe was not subtle about expectations. A queen had exactly 3 jobs. First, marry the king. Second, produce a male heir. Third, do not die too quickly while doing steps 1 and 2. That was it. No performance review. No exit interview. Just success, or quiet disgrace. Queens were not chosen for love. They were chosen for bloodlines, alliances, and hips that looked promising. Which, as you might imagine, was not a medically sound system. Now let's drift into our first unfortunate example. Let's begin with Eleanor of Provence. A queen who technically did everything right, and still spent years under a cloud of suspicion. Eleanor married King Henry III of England in the 1200s. She was young, well-connected, and immediately unpopular. Which is impressive, honestly. The problem wasn't her personality. Well, not only her personality. The real issue was time. Years passed. No baby. Courtiers whispered. Priests prayed louder. Doctors suggested remedies that mostly involved herbs and optimism. Because medieval medicine, of course it was. Henry waited. Which sounds kind. But waiting in medieval royal terms meant watching closely. Every month without a pregnancy became a small political crisis. Foreign ambassadors started reporting back home. Nobles began quietly wondering who would inherit the throne instead. And Eleanor felt it. Queens knew exactly what silence meant. No heir meant no security. No security meant replacement. Eventually, Eleanor did produce children. Several, in fact. But those early years mattered. They stuck to her reputation. She was always seen as slightly unreliable. And that's the thing about medieval queens. Even success didn't erase failure. It just covered it politely. Now let's float over to France. Because France specialized in marital disappointment. Here we meet Margaret of Burgundy. Margaret was married to Louis X of France. Her job was clear. Produce an heir. Preferably male. Immediately. She didn't. And unfortunately for Margaret, she lived in a court obsessed with scandal. When pregnancy didn't happen, suspicion arrived. Was she barren? Was she unfaithful? Was she cursed? The answer didn't really matter. Something had to be wrong. Margaret was accused of adultery, which, conveniently, removed her from the equation entirely. She was imprisoned, later strangled, which historians like to phrase delicately. The important thing is this. Her inability to secure a clear heir made it easier to erase her. No child meant no legacy. No legacy meant no protection. And yes, the accusations were likely exaggerated. But when a queen failed at reproduction, truth became optional. Let's gently slide to another case. Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II of England. Anne was loved, which already put her in rare company. Richard adored her. Publicly. The accusations were likely exaggerated. But when a queen failed at reproduction, truth became optional. Let's gently slide to another case. Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II of England. Anne was loved, which already put her in rare company. Richard adored her. Publicly. Almost embarrassingly. But they had no children. Years passed. Still nothing. Now here's where things get quietly cruel. Anne wasn't blamed aggressively. She wasn't imprisoned. She wasn't replaced. Instead, she was pitied. And in medieval courts, pity was worse than hatred. People whispered about divine punishment. They said the marriage was cursed. They said God disapproved. And died young. No heir. Richard never recovered, politically or emotionally. And yet, history still remembers Anne primarily as the queen who didn't produce a child, even when she was beloved. Now let's float further south. Into Spain. Ah yes. Spain, where dynastic anxiety was practically a national hobby. Here we meet Blanche of Bourbon, married to Peter of Castile. Peter had issues. Many issues. Most of them involving anger. Blanche married him young. Very young. She did not become pregnant. Peter lost interest immediately. Which is putting it kindly. He abandoned her. Publicly took mistresses. And eventually had her imprisoned. Why? Because a queen without an heir was no longer useful. She died in confinement. Quietly. Which medieval historians like because it saves paperwork. Now let's pause here for a second. Notice a pattern. Queens who failed to conceive didn't just lose favor. They lost visibility. They disappeared from ceremonies. From records. From memory. The absence of a child made their own existence optional. Let's drift back north again. Now let's pause here for a second. Notice a pattern. Queens who failed to conceive didn't just lose favor. They lost visibility. They disappeared from ceremonies. From records. From memory. The absence of a child made their own existence optional. Let's drift back north again. Isabella of Valois, child bride to Richard II. She was 6 years old when she married him. Yes. 6. Obviously, no children followed. And yet, the pressure still existed. Even though she was a literal child, her value was measured by potential pregnancy. When Richard was deposed and killed, Isabella was quietly returned to France. Unwanted. Unnecessary. Her marriage had produced nothing tangible. So she was returned like an unused alliance. She remarried later. Had children. But England never remembered her as anything more than a failed equation. Now let's gently hover over the medical reality of all this. Medieval queens often didn't fail to conceive because they were barren. They failed because they married too young. They suffered malnutrition. They experienced repeated miscarriages. They were pressured into constant pregnancy attempts. They lived under stress that would make modern doctors panic. And miscarriages? Those weren't discussed openly. A queen who miscarried didn't receive sympathy. She received silence. Because a miscarriage was dangerously close to proof of divine disfavor. Now let's talk about Catherine of Aragon. Yes. That Catherine. Catherine married Henry VIII. And for years, she did exactly what a queen was supposed to do. She became pregnant many times. Most pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. Only one child survived. Mary. And because Mary was female, it wasn't enough. Henry waited. Then worried. Then panicked. And then blamed Catherine. Of course he did. Catherine was older. Past her childbearing years. Which in medieval terms meant, expired. Henry declared the marriage invalid. Not because of love. But because Catherine's body had failed him. She was stripped of her title. Separated from her daughter. And died alone. Quietly. Still insisting she was queen. Now here's the sleepy irony. Catherine did produce a living heir. Henry simply didn't like the gender. So even success could be rewritten as failure. Now let's float over to another quietly tragic figure. Joan of Navarre, Queen of England. Joan actually had children. Several. But not with her second husband, Henry IV. And that mattered. Because children from a previous marriage didn't secure his dynasty. Joan was accused of witchcraft. Why? Because again, something had to explain the lack of heirs. Witchcraft was a convenient explanation. It always was. She was imprisoned. Later released. But her reputation never recovered. Now let's gently zoom out. Medieval queens lived under a constant countdown. Every year without a child reduced their value. Every miscarriage increased suspicion. Every whisper made them smaller. And the saddest part? Most of them internalized it. Letters survive. Prayers survive. Queens begging God for fertility. Promising pilgrimages. Promising obedience. Because they believed their worth depended on it. And in their world, it did. Now let's ease toward the end of this first part. Not all queens who failed to produce heirs were punished openly. Some were simply sidelined, ignored, politely forgotten. Their portraits hung, their names recorded, but their voices disappeared. Because history, like medieval kings, preferred results. In the next part, we'll drift into queens who were replaced. Queens who watched younger women take their place. Queens who lived long enough to see their own redundancy become official. Alright. Let's gently drift back in. Maybe you adjusted your pillow. Maybe your screen dimmed itself because even your phone knows this is bedtime history. When we last floated away, we were sitting with medieval queens whose primary job description could be summarized as, produce heir, repeat, do not fail. And when they did fail, well, history became very quiet about their feelings, and very loud about their supposed faults. So let's continue. One of the strangest things about medieval queens is how little control they had over the one thing they were judged on constantly. Fertility. Something no one fully understood. Something doctors guessed at. Something priests prayed over. Something courtiers whispered about. And yet, if a queen didn't deliver a healthy male child in a reasonable amount of time, everyone somehow agreed it was her problem. Of course they did. Let's float over to another royal marriage that went, predictably. Imagine a young queen. Barely 16. Probably still figuring out how royal gowns worked. Definitely not educated in anatomy beyond, God will handle it. She arrives at court. She's polite. She's beautiful enough by contemporary standards. She does everything expected of her. And then, year 1 passes. No pregnancy. Year 2. Still nothing. At first, everyone stays polite. Doctors are consulted. Astrologers are summoned. Someone suggests better timing with the moon. By year 3, the tone changes. The whispers begin. She seems healthy, but perhaps. Maybe her mother had trouble too. God tests us in mysterious ways. By year 4, she's no longer a person. She's a problem. And this is where medieval queens enter a special kind of psychological purgatory. Because they're still queens. Still crowned. Still ceremonial. But suddenly, watched. Every meal noted. Every illness exaggerated. Every emotional reaction interpreted as weakness. If she laughs too much, she's frivolous. If she cries, she's unstable. If she prays, she's desperate. There is no correct behavior when your womb is under political review. Now let's talk about rituals, because medieval courts loved rituals. especially when they didn't work. Queens who struggled to conceive were often subjected to elaborate fertility practices. Not because they helped, but because they felt productive. They were sent to holy shrines. They touched relics. They wore blessed charms sewn into their undergarments. Sometimes they were instructed to sleep with specific saints' images under their pillows, which is an intimate level of faith. Baths infused with herbs. Diet changes. Bloodletting, because of course bloodletting was involved. Medieval medicine never met a problem it didn't want to solve by removing blood. And all of this happened publicly. Everyone knew. Everyone commented. Everyone waited. Because a queen failing to conceive wasn't just a private tragedy. It was a national concern. Let's gently slide over to the emotional cost. Because here's the part history rarely records. These women were often isolated. Their ladies-in-waiting reported everything. Their letters were monitored. Their husbands, distant. Kings, once hopeful, often grew cold. Not always cruel. Just uninterested. Some took mistresses openly. Because why not double down on humiliation? And every time a mistress became pregnant, the implication hung in the air. See? The king works just fine. Which left only one suspect. Now here's the cruel irony. Many of these queens did eventually become pregnant. But medieval pregnancy was dangerous. Miscarriages were common. Stillbirths happened frequently. And yet, these losses weren't treated with sympathy. They were treated as further evidence. Evidence that something was wrong. A queen who miscarried didn't receive rest. She received scrutiny. How did she behave afterward? Did she mourn too much? Not enough. Was she emotionally stable? As if grief itself might sabotage future heirs. Let's pause for a moment and talk about blame. Because medieval society was obsessed with assigning it. If a queen couldn't produce an heir, explanations were eagerly invented. She was cursed. She had offended God. She had improper thoughts. She was too thin. Too emotional. Too educated. Not educated enough. It was a buffet of nonsense. Meanwhile, male infertility was barely acknowledged. Kings were assumed virile by default, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Because questioning a king's fertility would mean questioning his masculinity. And that was simply not done. Now let's drift toward the quiet consequences. Some queens were sent away. Not formally divorced. That would be messy. Instead, they were relocated. A comfortable estate. A distant castle. A polite exile. Officially, it was for health or spiritual reflection. Unofficially, it removed the problem from court. These women lived out their lives in semi-obscurity. Still queens in title. No longer queens in relevance. They sponsored chapels. They embroidered altar cloths. They aged. And history moved on without them. Others faced a harsher fate. If a marriage was annulled, the queen's entire existence was retroactively questioned. Suddenly her marriage was never valid, which meant her role was erased. No coronation mattered. No years of loyalty counted. She was returned to her family, often humiliated. Sometimes forced into a convent. And convent life wasn't always peaceful. It was quiet, regimented, endlessly reflective. A perfect environment to replay every failure. Now let's float to one of the saddest patterns of all. Queens who finally succeeded. After years of waiting. After pressure. After ritual and rumor. They produce an heir. Celebration erupts. Church bells ring. Coins are minted. And for a brief moment, everything is forgiven. Until the next expectation appears. Because one heir is never enough. What if he dies? What if there's no spare? So the cycle resumes. Produce again. And again. And again. Some queens spent nearly their entire adult lives pregnant. Or recovering from pregnancy. Or grieving loss. Their bodies became state property. Their pain, administrative. Let's talk about how they coped. Some turned deeply religious. Faith became a refuge. If God controlled fertility, then blame could be transferred upward. Others grew emotionally withdrawn. A quiet defense mechanism. A few developed reputations. She's cold. She's strange. She's unstable. Which often translated to, she's exhausted and emotionally burned out. But medieval courts didn't do burnout. They did gossip. Now here's a particularly bitter irony. Queens who failed to produce heirs were often remembered as boring. Not evil. Not dramatic. Just forgettable. History prefers villains and triumphs. Not quiet endurance. And so their stories faded. Until now. Because when you really look at them, these queens lived under a pressure so constant, so personal, that it reshaped their entire identity. They weren't allowed ambition, or curiosity, or rest. Only results. Let's gently drift toward the end of their lives. Many queens outlived their husbands. Which, oddly, was when some of them finally gained freedom. As dowager queens, they held lands. They controlled incomes. They advised children or nephews. Ironically, once they were no longer expected to produce heirs. They were trusted. They became competent. Wise. Respected. Because now their bodies no longer mattered. Only their minds. Which is a little too late. And as we prepare to float onward, remember this. Medieval queens weren't remembered for who they were. They were remembered for what they produced. Or didn't. Their value rose and fell with biology they couldn't control. Their emotions were inconveniences. Their suffering, background noise. So the next time you hear about a queen who failed, remember the system she lived inside, and how impossibly quiet her endurance had to be. Let's drift onward, because there are still more royal disappointments waiting softly in the dark. Hey guys! Tonight, we're easing into something slow, soft, and historically unfortunate. So dim the lights. Put your phone face down. Let the room get quiet. And let's gently drift back in time. Tonight, we're talking about royal princes. Specifically, the ones who had absolutely miserable childhoods. Because while we're told fairy tales about silk cradles and golden toys, the reality was usually different. Cold castles, strange adults, high expectations, zero affection, and a lifelong understanding that if you disappointed anyone, the consequences might be emotional neglect, or exile, or, occasionally, a quiet monastery with no exits. So let's begin. Not with screaming drama. Not with shocking reveals. Just a calm walk through history's most uncomfortable nurseries. Being born a royal prince sounded impressive. And on paper, it was. You were important before you could walk. Your name mattered before you could speak. Your body was considered state property before you could form memories. Which is already a lot for a toddler. Most princes were handed over to nurses almost immediately. Not because their mothers didn't care, but because royal women were expected to produce heirs, not raise them. So babies were passed along. From wet nurse, to governess, to tutor, to someone whose job title translated roughly to stern man with a stick. Emotional warmth was optional. Let's float over to one of the most famous examples. King Henry VI of England. Henry VI was crowned king at 9 months old. Which sounds impressive, but mostly meant that adults made decisions around him while he drooled quietly nearby. He grew up surrounded by regents, advisors, and political sharks. No father. No sense of stability. Just endless expectations and constant reminders that England was watching. Henry was gentle, quiet, deeply sensitive, which, in medieval England, was not ideal. He preferred prayer to training, books to weapons, silence to shouting. Other boys were learning sword drills. Henry was learning scripture, and apologizing for things he hadn't done. He didn't like loud voices. He didn't like conflict. He didn't like being king. And because of that, his childhood became a long rehearsal for failure. Everyone expected strength. He offered kindness. Everyone wanted dominance. He gave hesitation. So from a very young age, Henry learned something important. Being yourself was not enough. It never is, when you're royal. Now let's gently drift toward France. because French princes had their own flavor of misery. Charles VI of France, as a boy. Charles was raised to be magnificent. He was told he was chosen by God. That his blood was special. That France needed him. Which is a lot to put on a child who just learned how stairs work. His education was rigid. His schedule was exhausting. And affection was strictly regulated. Kings did not cuddle. Kings did not cry. Kings did not question. Charles learned discipline before joy. Obedience before comfort. And as he grew, the pressure didn't break him immediately. It waited. Like a stress fracture in the soul. By adulthood, Charles famously suffered mental collapse. But the foundation was laid early. A childhood without softness. Without safety. Without permission to be human. Just expectations stacked like stones. Now let's float eastward. Toward Spain. Where royal childhoods came with a bonus feature. Generational trauma. Prince Carlos of Spain. Carlos was born into the Habsburg family. Which already tells you how this is going to go. He was physically frail. Emotionally volatile. And raised in an environment that believed discipline cured everything. His father, Philip II, was distant. Cold. Methodical. Affection was not his strength. Carlos grew up lonely. Isolated. Constantly reminded of his inadequacies. He struggled with learning. With impulse control. With rage. And instead of care, he received correction. More rules. More surveillance. More disappointment. By adolescence, Carlos was deeply unstable. Paranoid. Angry. Desperate for approval he would never get. His childhood wasn't violent. It was worse. It was empty. Now let's slide gently north. To Scandinavia. Because cold weather pairs beautifully with emotional restraint. Erik XIV of Sweden. Erik was raised knowing he was clever. Too clever, perhaps. He was educated intensely. Languages. Philosophy. Astronomy. But emotional education, that was not included. His father, Gustav Vasa, ruled through fear. And Erik learned early that love was conditional. Praise came with strings. Affection came with expectations. Erik grew anxious. Suspicious. Obsessed with slights. By the time he became king, he was already exhausted from trying to be enough. His childhood taught him one thing very well. Trust no one. Especially not yourself. Now let's drift south again. Toward the Holy Roman Empire. Where titles were long, and childhoods were short. Leopold I, as a child. Leopold wasn't meant to be emperor. He was supposed to be a priest. Which meant his childhood was filled with theology, silence, and preparation for a life he didn't choose. When his older brother died, everything changed. Suddenly, Leopold was repurposed. From quiet scholar to public figure. From prayer to politics. And the transition was not gentle. He was shy, physically awkward, deeply self-conscious. And now, everyone was watching. His childhood ended abruptly, replaced by scrutiny, which tends to leave marks. Now let's pause for a moment. Because a pattern is forming. Royal princes weren't abused in the obvious ways. They weren't beaten daily. They weren't starved. Instead, they were denied something quieter. Choice. Safety. Ordinary affection. They were raised to perform, not to exist. Let's float over to Russia. Because Russian royal childhoods were intense. Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan's childhood was chaos. His father died early. His mother likely poisoned. And the boy was left in a palace full of hostile nobles. He was neglected, mocked, ignored, sometimes fed, sometimes not. Ivan learned fear early, humiliation early, resentment early. No one protected him. No one guided him. So when he grew older, he remembered everything. Every slight. Every cold look. Every moment of powerlessness. His childhood didn't just shape him. It sharpened him. Now let's drift gently back west. To England again. Because England produced misery with remarkable consistency. Edward VI. Edward was sickly, fragile, and constantly monitored. His education was strict. His health was precarious. And everyone around him knew something he didn't. He wasn't expected to live long. Which makes childhood feel urgent. Edward was pushed. Overworked. Overeducated. No rest. No softness. Just preparation for a future he never reached. He died young. Exhausted. Now let's take a breath. Because we're only getting started. Royal childhoods weren't short because life was shorter. They were short because innocence was considered dangerous. A prince needed control. Discipline. Distance. Love was inefficient. Let's float toward France again. Louis XIII. Louis was raised by servants. Separated from his mother. Surrounded by rigid protocol. He was anxious. Socially awkward. Uncomfortable in his own skin. He learned early that emotions were inconvenient. So he swallowed them. And that swallowing never stopped. By now, you might notice something gentle and sad. These princes weren't raised to be happy. They were raised to be useful. Their childhoods weren't meant to nurture. They were meant to mold. And often, they cracked instead. So as we drift forward, into the next stretch of history, We'll meet more princes. More fragile boys in heavy crowns. More children taught that love must be earned. But for now, let's rest here. In cold stone corridors. With quiet footsteps. And children who learn too early that being born royal did not mean being protected. Let's drift back in. No need to sit up. Just let the story keep moving at its own slow pace. When we last floated away, we were circling around the idea that royal childhoods were not exactly full of laughter, hugs, or emotional check-ins. They were more like extended waiting rooms. Cold ones. With tutors. And expectations. Lots of expectations. So let's gently slide over to another prince who learned very early that being born important did not mean being born comfortable. This time, we arrive in France, because of course we do. France was excellent at producing princes who looked fine on tapestries and deeply unwell in real life. Take Louis XIII of France. As a child, Louis was small, quiet, anxious, and painfully shy, which was unfortunate because his father, Henry IV, was loud, charismatic, famously womanizing, and generally the opposite of everything young Louis was. Henry IV loved hunting, fighting, joking, and being adored by crowds. Louis preferred silence, routine, and not being noticed at all. Naturally, this caused problems. From an early age, Louis was treated less like a child and more like a disappointing draft pick. His father found him weak. His courtiers found him strange. His mother, Marie de Medici, found him useful mostly as a political object. Louis spent much of his childhood isolated in palaces that were full of people but somehow always lonely. He was surrounded by servants, yet emotionally untouched by them. He was given tutors, but not comfort. Structure, but not warmth. He developed nervous habits. He struggled with speech. He avoided eye contact. In a modern setting, someone might have gently asked if he was okay. In medieval France, they mostly asked why he wasn't more impressive. When Henry IV was assassinated, Louis was still a child. Suddenly, the anxious boy became king, which did not help. His mother ruled as regent, sidelining him. Court factions whispered. Expectations grew heavier. Louis learned that power did not bring relief. It only brought more people watching him fail quietly. He grew into an adult king who remained withdrawn, obsessive, and emotionally distant. His childhood never really ended. It just hardened. And with that soft sadness lingering in the air, let's float eastward. Over to Russia, where royal childhoods had an entirely different flavor of misery. Here we meet Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. But for now, he's just Ivan. A boy. Small. Alone. Watching everything. Ivan was born into power, but not into safety. His father died when he was very young. His mother died soon after, likely poisoned. Which is not ideal for childhood development. After her death, Ivan was effectively abandoned inside the Kremlin. The boy who would one day terrorize Russia was left to wander palace halls while noble families fought over power around him. He was neglected, ignored, mocked, sometimes physically abused. Servants withheld food. Nobles treated him like furniture. No one expected him to survive long enough to matter. So he watched. He watched cruelty. He watched betrayal. He watched adults manipulate each other with calm smiles. He learned that power was something you took, not something given. Ivan's childhood was not loud misery. It was quiet neglect, which is often worse. He developed rage early. Not the dramatic kind. The cold, observant kind. He tortured animals. He lashed out at servants. He learned that fear worked. Again, modern psychology would have had a field day. Medieval Russia just nodded and waited. When Ivan finally took power, he remembered everything. And everyone. His later reign was brutal, paranoid, and violent. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from a childhood where no one protected him. Where affection was absent. Where power was the only language anyone seemed to speak. Let's move gently away from Ivan now. That particular sadness gets heavy if we linger. Instead, let's slide south. To Spain. Because Spain, at this time, was very good at making princes deeply uncomfortable. Here we meet Don Carlos, son of Philip II of Spain. Don Carlos had what you might call a complicated childhood. He was physically frail, mentally unstable, and genetically unfortunate. Thanks to generations of intermarriage, Carlos was born with deformities, health problems, and cognitive issues. His jaw barely worked. His legs were weak. His moods were unpredictable. From the moment he could be observed, he was judged. His father, Philip II, was cold, rigid, and intensely religious. He did not understand weakness. He did not tolerate chaos. And his son was both. Carlos was isolated, controlled, watched constantly. He was educated, but never trusted. Loved in theory, but not in practice. Court tutors described him as cruel, impulsive, and emotionally volatile. But they also described a boy desperate for affection. He lashed out. He rebelled in small ways. He frightened servants. And instead of help, he received stricter confinement. His childhood became a series of locked doors and whispered discussions about whether he should ever rule at all. Eventually, his father imprisoned him. Not in a dungeon, but in comfortable rooms with guards. Which somehow feels worse. Carlos died young. Still isolated. Still misunderstood. A prince shaped by a childhood that never allowed softness. Let's drift onward. Across the Channel. Back to England. This time, we meet Edward VI, son of Henry VIII. Edward's childhood misery was quieter, cleaner, and medically supervised. He was sickly from the beginning. Thin. Fragile. Watched closely by doctors who believed bleeding children was a solid medical strategy. Edward was also extremely intelligent, which made everything worse. From a young age, he was taught that he was England's hope. The future. The solution to all problems created by his father's many marriages. That is a heavy thing to put on a small boy. Edward studied constantly. Theology. Languages. Governance. He rarely played. Rarely relaxed. Rarely felt like a child. His father doted on him in public, but Henry VIII was not exactly warm. Affection came with expectations. Praise came with pressure. Edward grew serious. Intense. Deeply religious. He wrote about policy while other boys learned games. By the time he became king at 9 years old, he was already exhausted. His body gave out before his mind ever got to rest. Edward died at 15. A child king who never had time to be anything else. And as we let that fade, let's float further into Central Europe. To the Holy Roman Empire. A place famous for complicated titles and deeply unhappy princes. Enter Charles II of Spain. Yes. Another Charles. And yes. Another genetic tragedy. Charles II was the final result of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. He was physically disabled. Developmentally delayed. Chronically ill. As a child, he struggled to walk. To speak. To eat properly. He was terrified easily. Confused often. And constantly examined. Doctors debated him like a puzzle. Priests prayed over him. Courtiers whispered. His childhood was not cruel in the loud sense. It was cruel in its endless observation. Everyone looked at him to see what was wrong. No one asked how he felt. He was raised to believe he was chosen by God. And also deeply broken. He grew up surrounded by rituals meant to fix him. Exorcisms. Treatments. Restrictions. Instead of friends, he had caretakers. Instead of play, he had scrutiny. By adulthood, Charles was emotionally fragile and easily manipulated. His childhood had trained him to comply. To trust authority. To never question. And when he died without an heir, an entire continent went to war. Which feels like an excessive consequence for one deeply tired child. Let's gently pull away from that and head north. To Scandinavia. Here we find Christian VII of Denmark. Christian's childhood was rigid, lonely, and psychologically damaging in a quieter, colder way. He was raised under strict discipline. Affection was discouraged. Emotions were suspect. Silence was valued. Christian was sensitive by nature. Which did not go well. He developed anxiety early. Possibly schizophrenia. He self-harmed. He experienced hallucinations. Instead of help, he received more discipline. Tutors punished him for behavior he could not control. Caretakers isolated him further. By the time he became king, Christian was deeply unstable. Power frightened him. Court life overwhelmed him. Others ruled in his name while he drifted in and out of lucidity. A king shaped by a childhood that crushed vulnerability instead of protecting it. And finally, let's slow everything down. One last prince for this stretch. Alexei Nikolaevich, son of Nicholas II of Russia. Alexei was born with hemophilia. A secret illness. A dangerous one. From infancy, his childhood was wrapped in fear. Every bruise was a potential death sentence. He was constantly watched. Constantly protected. Never allowed freedom. His parents loved him deeply. But that love came with suffocation. Alexei learned early that his pain caused panic. That his existence held the fate of an empire. He was kept away from other children. Shielded from normal life. Told to be brave while being quietly terrified. His childhood was not abusive. But it was fragile. And when the Russian Revolution came, that fragility shattered. But that is a story for later. For now, let's pause here. A collection of princes. Different countries. Different centuries. All raised with crowns waiting for them. And childhoods that rarely belonged to them at all. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow things down a little. Dim the lights. Lower the volume. Maybe put the phone face down. Because tonight, we're talking about childhood. But not the fun kind. Not scraped knees and stolen cookies. We're talking about royal childhoods. Specifically, royal princes. Boys born into palaces. Surrounded by gold. And somehow, absolutely miserable. So take a breath. Get comfortable. And let's begin. When people imagine royal princes, they usually picture silk clothes, endless feasts, tutors waiting patiently with books, and servants ready to do literally everything. And yes, technically, all of that existed. But so did isolation. Pressure. Fear. And expectations so heavy they could flatten a grown adult, let alone a small child with bad teeth and chronic stomach problems. Because royal childhoods were never really about being children. They were about being future property. A prince wasn't loved. He was managed. From the moment he could stand without wobbling too much, his life stopped belonging to him. Every breath was political. Every cough was dynastic. Every failure was a potential crisis for the entire kingdom. Which is, a lot, honestly. So let's float gently into our first unhappy royal nursery. One of the most famously miserable royal childhoods belonged to King Henry VI of England. And yes, of course it was England. It's always England. Henry became king when he was 9 months old. Not 9 years. Months. He could not speak. He could not walk. He could barely sit upright without assistance. But legally, he was in charge of a kingdom. Naturally. This meant Henry was raised not as a child, but as a symbol. Everyone spoke around him. Decisions were made over his head. Men argued loudly in rooms where he was trying to nap. His childhood caretakers weren't warm or affectionate. They were cautious. They worried constantly about poisoning, kidnapping, or political manipulation. So Henry grew up sheltered, isolated, and deeply anxious. He was not taught confidence. He was taught obedience. Quiet. Soft-spoken. Deeply religious. And emotionally fragile. By the time he reached adulthood, Henry showed signs of severe mental illness. Long periods of silence. Complete emotional withdrawal. An inability to recognize his own family. And honestly, considering his upbringing, it's not surprising. He was never allowed to be a person. Only a crown with a pulse. Let's drift onward. Next, we meet Philip II of Spain, a prince who grew up surrounded by luxury, yet somehow emotionally starved. Philip's father, Charles V, was one of the most powerful men in Europe. He was also rarely home. Because when you rule half the known world, parenting becomes more of a side quest. Philip was raised in formal silence. His household followed strict etiquette rules. No casual conversation. No spontaneous affection. No emotional warmth. He learned early that showing feelings was dangerous. So he didn't. He became withdrawn. Rigid. Obsessed with order. As a child, Philip spent hours alone in prayer. Not because he wanted to, but because it was expected. When his mother died, he was devastated. And then told to move on quietly. Public grief was considered undignified. So he buried it. Deep. As an adult, Philip became famously cold and distant. He ruled from behind paperwork. Preferred isolation. Distrusted almost everyone. And again, of course he did. That's what happens when your childhood is a monastery with better furniture. Now let's gently shuffle over to France. Because French princes were miserable in their own special way. Meet Louis XIII of France. Louis was born sickly. Weak lungs. Poor appetite. Constant illnesses. His mother, Marie de Medici, did not like him. She preferred his younger brother. Which is not ideal for a child. Louis was neglected emotionally, ignored physically, and raised by servants who rotated frequently. He grew up anxious and painfully shy, terrified of public appearances, terrified of his mother, terrified of failing. When his father was assassinated, Louis was only 8. Suddenly king. Still frightened. Still ignored. Still desperately lonely. Court politics swirled around him like fog. He withdrew further. developed nervous habits, struggled with depression. Later in life, he found comfort only in rigid routines and hunting. Emotionally distant, uncomfortable with intimacy, and deeply insecure. Another childhood success story. Let's float over to the Holy Roman Empire now, where childhood misery was basically tradition. Rudolph II is a particularly soft example. Because nothing loud happens. Everything just quietly goes wrong. Rudolph was sent away from home as a child to be educated at the Spanish court. This was common, and also deeply traumatic. He was separated from his parents, placed in an emotionally cold environment, expected to behave like a miniature adult. No warmth, no reassurance, just rules. Rudolph developed severe anxiety. He became introverted, suspicious, obsessed with astrology and alchemy. As emperor, he isolated himself almost completely, refused to meet people, trusted no one, and gradually lost control of his empire. His childhood didn't break him loudly. It broke him slowly, quietly, like water dripping through stone. Now let's pause for a moment. Because by now, a pattern is forming. Royal princes were not raised to be happy. They were raised to be useful. They were separated from parents early, surrounded by tutors, guards, and political enemies, constantly reminded that their bodies and futures belonged to the state. Even playtime was regulated. Even friendships were monitored. Even emotions were suspicious. Which brings us to one of the saddest royal childhoods of all. Ivan IV of Russia, better known later as Ivan the Terrible, which, spoiler alert, did not come out of nowhere. Ivan's father died when he was 3. His mother likely poisoned when he was 8. After that, Ivan was left in the care of feuding noble families. They ignored him, mocked him, neglected him. Sometimes he was left hungry, sometimes locked away, sometimes publicly humiliated. Ivan learned early that power meant survival, and cruelty meant safety. As a child, he reportedly tortured animals. Not out of excitement, but control. Because when everything else is taken from you, control feels like oxygen. His reign later became infamous. But his childhood explains a lot. A lonely boy in a palace, surrounded by enemies, growing up afraid. Let's float away from that now. Slowly. Not all miserable royal childhoods created tyrants. Some just created broken men. Take Charles II of Spain, a walking example of dynastic inbreeding. Charles was physically weak, developmentally delayed, chronically ill. He couldn't walk properly until age 8. Could barely speak clearly. Struggled to eat. Yet he was constantly displayed as the future king. Put on parade. Forced into public appearances. Doctors examined him endlessly. Courtiers whispered constantly. His childhood was a medical experiment and a political tragedy. He grew up knowing he was wrong, that his body didn't work like it should, that everyone noticed. And yet the pressure never eased, because the crown needed him, even when he couldn't carry it. By now, it's easy to see the irony. Royal princes had everything, except safety, except affection, except freedom. They slept in grand rooms, but never peacefully. They wore fine clothes, but carried crushing expectations underneath. And as we drift further into history, this pattern continues. Different countries, different crowns, same quiet misery. Because being born royal wasn't a blessing. It was an assignment. And childhood was simply the first phase of service. So take another breath. Let the noise fade. In the next part, we'll continue drifting through palaces and nurseries, meeting more princes who never really got to be children. Because history is full of kings, but it's even fuller of boys who were never allowed to grow up properly. And honestly, that might be the saddest story of all.